Asus's new Flow X13 and XG Mobile are pretty much the epitome of the ultra-portable laptop with external GPU form factor. This laptop, the Flow X13, offers an 8-core Ryzen CPU in something this tiny, as well as a GTX 1650 Max-Q for some on-the-go gaming, but with a single connector can offer RTX 3080 laptop performance. So this is pretty much the ultimate version of this form factor. Or is it? The Flow X13 is a pretty unique design. It has a 16 by 10, so 1200p resolution display, which is IPS, but is both 120Hz and offers 100% coverage of the sRGB spectrum. It's also a touchscreen, as you can fold it over into tablet mode if you want to do some, light reading or some YouTube watching instead. And it's pretty easy to do that. It's also pretty good for the touch sensitivity, and so it seems like a pretty interesting form factor. The downside is that the panel isn't very bright. They list 150 nits of brightness at 84%, which isn't fantastic, and as you can see from my relatively bright studio lights, this thing isn't the brightest, and even while looking at it here, it's not great, so using it in bright outdoor environments isn't going to work well for it. But when it comes to the power though, well, that's really impressive. This is rocking a Ryzen 9 5980HS, which is essentially a slightly lower power version of the same 8-core CPU that we've been seeing killing it in a load of different models. This runs at peak at 65 watts and is really very impressive. It's actually faster in single-threaded numbers than the 5800H that you'll find in a lot of the more standard gaming laptops, although in multi-threaded, thanks to its relatively low power budget and thermal budget available, it does tend to struggle a little bit more. Let's take a look at some of those CPU workloads. Starting with Cinebench and R20 in single-threaded results, you can see that the 5900HS that's in the Flow 13 is actually the second fastest chip, and it's only second by 2 points. It's pretty much on par, I would call it within margin of error, of the 5900X HX that's in the Zephyrus Duo, and beats out everything else under the graph, including a competitor in the Razer Blade Stealth, which uses an Intel Evo 1165G7. In multi-threaded, it's a little bit slower on the whole, especially thanks to its thermal and power budgets, but it's still the third fastest chip I've tested. It is slower than the 5800H in the Strix G15, which I think in its turbo mode drew about 80 watts instead, and the 5900HX in the Zephyrus Duo does have a convincing lead, but again, comparing to the 1165G7 in the Razer Blade Stealth, which is its direct competitor in terms of class, well, it's more than twice as fast. That translates into more real-world tests like Blender and rendering the BMW scene, where, especially because of its thermal budget, it can't push quite as hard, and so there are a few other chips, including the 5800H and the 5900HX that do beat it, but again, comparing to its class competitor, the 1165G7, it's more than twice as fast. The same goes for the Gooseberry render as well, where this one actually doesn't do so badly compared to the 5800H, especially in its stock mode, where the Flow X13's turbo is 65 watts, and the stock G15 performance is also 65 watts, so you can see the slightly faster chip working its magic. But again, compared to the Blade Stealth, it's more than twice as fast. Taking a look at the Puget bench for both Premiere, After Effects and Photoshop, these are effectively sort of without context numbers, but to give you an idea, it's overall pretty good, except for in Premiere where it does struggle a little bit more. When it comes to graphics power, you do have that GTX 1650 Max-Q built in, should you want to do a little bit of gaming while you're out and about and without the XG Mobile. With the performance you get with this, it's not fantastic. As you would kind of expect from a 1650 Max-Q, it's a relatively low power chip. In fact, it only runs at a very peak of 40 watts with dynamic boost, and that's not, well, the most impressive. Of course, for this form factor, it's very good. You don't often see even dedicated graphics at all in this sort of form factor, and even when you do, it is this sort of level, so it's pretty standard, if not better than most in this sort of class. With that said, despite it's only 4GB of VRAM, if you're only playing sort of esports titles, things like Fortnite, Rainbow Six Siege, Rocket League, or League of Legends, Dota, any of those sorts of titles, especially on lower settings, you're gonna have a pretty good time. My benchmark for Fortnite with running on low settings but at 100% render scale showed 168 FPS average and over 100 FPS in the 1% lows. Unfortunately, if you're planning on playing any more demanding titles, something like Watch Dogs Legion, then you're gonna be looking forward to around 47 FPS average at low settings at 1200p, or in a game like Cyberpunk, which is even more demanding, again, even on low settings, you're looking at, I think, 33 FPS and a 1% low of just 24. How cinematic. I would also normally benchmark COD Modern Warfare here, but unfortunately, it wouldn't run. It wouldn't run both with the XGM connected and just on the laptop itself. It was complaining of a graphics error, and I tried reinstalling the game, verifying the files, doing new drivers, everything that you would expect to try, and none of it solved the problem, so unfortunately I can't include those numbers here. With that said, if you're feeling a little underwhelmed by the performance that this laptop offers, then I've got the solution for you right here. This is the XG Mobile, and this is essentially an RTX 3080 laptop GPU in an external enclosure with a relatively proprietary connector on the end of it. It requires AC power connected to it, a standard kettle lead, to run, to operate, to work at all. But for your AC power, you do get effectively a charger for the laptop. You also get, like I said, an RTX 3080 laptop that powers the system just fine. And you even get 4 USB 3 ports, DisplayPort and HDMI ports, and Ethernet as well. It connects via this XGM connector, which is essentially a USB Type-C port and what looks like a semi-proprietary connector that runs PCIe Gen 3 by 8. It connects to the XGM port on the left-hand side of the laptop, which, by the way, has a little dust cover, a little rubber cover that isn't actually attached to the laptop, so the first time you take that off, well, it's probably gone forever. With that said, it clicks into place, you click the little red locking tab on the top, and then you use the utility on Windows to activate it, to enable it, to arm the device. It does take a little while for this to activate, and the screen might turn off and then turn back on again, but once it's enabled, you have access to that 3080 laptop GPU from the same machine. The connector is something that I would worry about a little bit. It's a very large, effectively hunk of plastic, and when you do plug it in, even once it's locked in place, it still wobbles around a fair bit, and since I've experienced the XG Mobile falling over because of the power cord a fair number of times, I would be worried about the XG Mobile falling over from wherever it is and just shearing the connector off, which would be a very bad time. Once it's up and running though, like I said, you get full access to an RTX 3080 laptop GPU, which offers some pretty impressive performance. Take a look at how the laptop now compares on high settings or ultra settings for everything compared to a couple of other laptops that I've reviewed recently. Starting off with Cyberpunk on ultra settings, and I should make it clear, running on the laptop's internal display, meaning running at 1200p rather than the 1080p that the rest of the results that I have already collected were at. With that said, the Flow X13 and XG Mobile are actually the second fastest setup I've tested here, only 5 FPS slower than the native 3080 and 5900HX in the Zephyrus Duo. In Watch Dogs Legion, it actually leads the pack, again with a higher resolution and with a higher 1% low figure as well, meaning that if you were to run it natively and on a 1080p external display, you'd likely get even more performance here, which is incredible. In Fortnite, it's slightly lower than the pack again. It's a slightly bigger gap to the native 3080 and 1500X HX in the Zephyrus Duo, but it's still a pretty decent experience. And again, if you were to run it on an external display, which since you need AC power connected at all times, you may as well, you're likely going to get much better performance out of it and a better playing experience too. Playing games on this, even with the XG Mobile connected, doesn't feel like a great experience. The first reason is that the display is pretty slow. Despite it still being 120Hz refresh rates, the panel itself isn't the fastest, and so ends up a very smeary, ghosting mess across the screen across any fast motion. I don't normally get any level of visual or motion sickness while playing with displays, but with this one, I did actually feel a little bit sick while using it. On top of that, because the display is so small, I ended up finding myself getting closer and closer and closer just to see what was going on in game, and ended up with a pretty awkward and uncomfortable posture. And its 16:10 aspect ratio doesn't feel great either. It's kind of weird, but it does feel fairly square compared to a standard 16:9 display. It feels a lot closer to 4:3 than I would really like it to, and a lot of games don't seem to support it very well with either black bars along the top and bottom or with stretched UIs. And even on top of that, just watching things like YouTube videos or Netflix or whatever else, you're going to have black bars on the top and bottom of your screen, which you wouldn't have with a more normal form factor machine. For me, that kind of feels like a bit of a step backwards, but actually what feels like more of a step backwards is the lack of I/O. You have one USB-A port, and technically you have two USB Type-C ports, although one of them is built into the XGM connector, which if you're using it, well, that's obviously not available, and so you're pretty much gonna need a dongle if you want to use this machine on a regular basis, which brings up the hashtag #ThatDongleLife. And then there's kind of the whole concept, well, as a whole. Eons ago, I checked out a prototype machine at MSI called the GS30, which was, at least for the time, a relatively thin and light laptop that had a reasonably powerful CPU with, I think, no dedicated GPU, or maybe a very light one, but was sold with a fairly large GPU dock that you would turn the laptop off, dock it in the top, turn it back on, and then it would use the graphics card that was inside the box, and it actually even had storage in there so that you could store your game library at home with your graphics card and only take the files that you needed for out and about. That was a really interesting concept, and especially at the time, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, especially considering the gap between laptop GPUs and desktop GPUs at the time was an absolute chasm. Well, it seemed like a really cool concept. And this Asus setup seems like the ultimate version of that ideal, right? I mean, it's a relatively thin and relatively portable GPU and an incredibly thin, light and portable laptop. So what's not to love? Well, the thing is, if you were willing to cart around this box, right, which weighs a fair bit actually, and this laptop, why would you not be willing to cart around a standard laptop like an Asus Strix G15, which has very similar overall power to this configuration, but is a lot more usable because it's all inside one box. You only need one plug and one AC adapter to use it, and you could actually game on the go with it without being plugged in. Whereas with this, unless you have AC power, this is useless. This will not work, this will not even connect, not even the USB ports will work until you connect AC power to it. On top of that, the XG Mobile isn't upgradable. In theory, Asus could come out with newer versions of the XG Mobile that you could use with the same laptop in the future, but in practice, well, we've heard that story before, MX10 module upgrades that never materialized, and it's also not compatible with any other machine, at least right now. So once the usefulness of this XG Mobile, or even both of them together, as again, this is the only configuration or the only pairing that works with this, they basically just become e-waste. At least with Razer's much more cumbersome and a lot less portable solution, you can use it with any Thunderbolt equipped laptop and with any graphics card you want. You can upgrade both the laptop and the graphics card that's in the box independently of each other and of the enclosure, which means that at least the enclosure itself doesn't just become scrap metal the second that a new GPU comes out. For me, this form factor or this setup is trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist, right? Like, if you're willing to spend a little over £3,000 on this configuration, why would you not buy a standard gaming laptop for half the price and get a much more functionally usable setup? Or if you really want the ultimate in portability, go and buy a thin and light Ultrabook like the Lenovo Yoga 9i I reviewed recently for the same price as this, and then go and buy a standard laptop or even build a desktop for less money than the XG Mobile, and you get a better system that's upgradable in the future. But if you forget that the XG Mobile exists, which since you can't buy one right now anyway, it may as well do, and just look at the laptop on its own, it starts to make a lot more sense. Because in the Ultrabook laptop form factor, this might very well be one of the best ones you could buy. Now sure, the display still isn't fantastic, and the 16:10 aspect ratio definitely won't be for everyone, but the fact that it has an incredibly powerful 8-core Ryzen CPU and a dedicated NVIDIA graphics card for things like acceleration in rendering, well, now it starts to make a lot more sense. It's also actually a good bit cheaper than that Lenovo Yoga 9i I mentioned, while having so much more performance. While I don't think that I could see myself using this laptop even on its own, forgetting the XG Mobile, I would much rather have a standard laptop myself. If you're only looking for an Ultrabook, this actually might be a very good option. And sure, you might have the ability to upgrade to an XG or include an XG Mobile later, but honestly, if you're planning on doing that, I would highly recommend either building a desktop PC, since this needs to be terminally connected to the wall anyway, or just buying a more powerful laptop and using this for work and the gaming laptop for play. With that said, as always, those are my thoughts, and I would love to hear yours in those comments down below. What do you think of the Flow X13 and the XG Mobile? Is there something you'd pick up yourself? Also, if you have any suggestions for, I suppose, use case for why you would buy an XG Mobile instead of just a desktop PC or a normal gaming laptop, or even something like Razer's solution instead, do let me know, as I'm clearly not the target market for this, and so having someone else's perspective would be greatly appreciated. Now, as always, I'm going to leave links to them both in the description down below. Like I said, the XG Mobile is currently completely out of stock, and so you might not be able to find that, but there are a few places that are stocking the Flow X13, so I'll leave some links in the description down below. Those will likely be Amazon affiliate links that will take you to a local Amazon store where you can see pricing when and where you watch this, because it can and does vary. There's also a load of other links in the description down below you can check out, from merch or hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs. There's also Patreon for access to our Moneyman Discord chat, sponsor-free videos, and of course you support me directly as well. And that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. Maybe check out the Strix G15 review or the Lenovo Yoga 9i in the cards in the end. And yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.